This week, what we're looking at are archival photographs. This is not the first time we've looked at archival material in this class. You looked at it with Assemblyx. She calls it a documentary called 3000, and in that documentary, she also looked at or implemented and used, or whatever fancy terminology you want to insert in there, archival footage. I believe some of it was still, much of it was film. And for this week, we're looking at photographs, and these photographs range, I believe it's from the 1920s into the 1970s. These photographs were placed in a book called Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, Portraits of Everyday Life in 8 Indigenous Communities, 7 communities in Canada, 1 in the United States. And they were placed together by the writer and the author of Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, Paul Seesequasis. And he is a Plains Cree man from right now he's living in Saskatoon, but I believe his family is from Saskatchewan. So the objectives for this lecture this week are, of course, we're going to look at the 3 articles. 2 of the 3 articles are on the Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun. The middle article is That's My Auntie, a New Book Reframes Photos from Indigenous Communities. That's actually a interview with Paul Seesequasis. So we will also, of course, look at that. We'll go over terms and definitions first. We'll look at the CBC article, the interview. We will also briefly consider the Inuit artist, Kenojuak Ashevak. Sorry, I had to really work on that, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, as well as the photographer Rosemary Eaton. And then we are closing with the final article, the Indigenous Archival Photo Project, which was published, I think, in Galleries West. There's also another link on Heritage Canada Minutes. Again, this one, I'm not sure why I said again, that Heritage Minutes Canada segment available on YouTube, follow the link, is on the Inuit artist Kenojuak Ashevak. So terms and definitions. I'm not going to read through this because of course you can pause it and read through it yourself. What I do want us to pay attention to though, and are this area here, this area here, and this area. So I really want you to really think of that as we're going through these articles. The idea of a frame as a way of packaging something, a way of kind of getting audiences, readers, people to look at something in a very specific way. So we see this in mass media, politics, we see it on Twitter, we see it on social media, and of course we see it in much more stylistic terminology, a more stylistic terminology in photography and cinematography as a technique used to bring the focus to the subject. So where you're actually focusing attention on the subject of whatever it is that you are framing. So we're seeing this at work throughout kind of discussions on this collection of images. So I'll leave that there but I will return to it. Reframing is a technique that is used to create a different way of looking at a situation, a person, a relationship, by changing its meaning. So by almost like changing perspective, of like kind of shifting the perspective so that you're seeing something in a different way. So the first article is CBC's News, no authors listed. That's why I'm just saying CBC News. Resilience and Strength. Photos show the untold history of Indigenous people. And this was published the 10th of November 2019. So, and then this is just referring to this photograph. So Oliver Rupert in sunglasses and other young Cree men in Fort George, Quebec in 1973. And then it goes on to state, this is a quote from the article, Paul Seesequasis says the archival photos he has collected for his book, Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, illustrate an alternate, more positive version of Indigenous history than the narrative that is usually shared. So now, like as you're reading that, consider how that is being reframed. Illustrates an alternate. So it's kind of in our face. He's telling us. The article from CBC News is telling us that they're kind of saying that Paul Seesequasis, and maybe there's a quote of him saying that himself in a bit, but Paul Seesequasis, his book is illustrating an alternate, more positive version of Indigenous history than the narrative that is usually shared. So there's, as usual, think of what's happening between these lines. So what is usually shared? What what is that that is usually shared? Why is that blank? What is being said here? This is another image from, of course, there are many images in Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun. It is a book of photographs. So the photo from the previous slide is Cree women Beatrice Gilpin, Josephine Mayapo, and Laura Moses in East Maine, Quebec in 1973. This photo to the left is Emma Alfred with a beaver foot purse in Pelly Crossing in the Yukon in 1951. Photo on the following slide is Cree fiddler Bobby George Kish plays after a wedding in 1973. So I've given you a summary. This is the only article that I summarized in this week's material that we're looking at. I'll just point out the usual things that happen. No author, oops, that's way too dark, pardon me. No author, so I am giving you CBC, the title, and of course the date, and then the things that matter. You know, who are we talking about? What material? And then, you know, I tell you what the article itself is saying. So CBC's Resilience and Strength photos show the untold history of Indigenous people. 10 November 2019 discusses Paul Seesequasis' work that has culminated in his book Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun. Seesequasis spent years collecting archival photos of Indigenous people that he located online. Many reached out to Seesequasis through Twitter and other social media to expand upon the photos, providing names, places, and so on. One photo assisted a family in locating an heirloom. It was found in the Canadian Museum of Natural History in 2015. Seesequasis wanted to find photos that represented the resilience. So I'm going to stop here for a moment. This, in case you don't know, this is just indicating that this spelling error is not mine. This is telling you that I know this is a spelling error. I didn't make it. That's why I'm letting you know. This is not my error. It's in the original text. I do not create or correct a previous text. I am just tell you the spelling mistake. I'm like, here it is. I didn't do it. So wanted to find photos that represented the resilience, strength, and humor of the Indigenous peoples. He was inspired by his mother, a survivor of the residential school system and a witness for the TRC. Seesequasis' mother told him the Indigenous communities possess a flexibility and a hardiness within their family, kinship, and communities, even during their darkest times. Seesequasis asserts that without the spirit of flexibility and strength that is apparent currently, the revival within the Indigenous communities of culture, language, and writing couldn't have endured. So I don't think that Paul Seesequasis is trying to reframe anything. I think he's pointing out that I think he's trying to I think this book dismantles stereotypes, um, dismantles these kind of romantic notions that might persist, and as well, I think what is being overlooked in all of the articles that I've read about this book is the idea that trauma was somehow stopping every Indigenous community in its tracks. And that doesn't happen. Yes, your children are taken away from you. They go to residential school and you still get up in the mornings. You still make your bed. You make dinner. You go hunting. You go to work. Are you happy? No. But does your life stop? No. No. So this idea that's persisting around this book that almost kind of like, oh, look at these images of strength and resilience. It's almost kind of like, what a nice thing to see, rather than all the dark discussions of residential school, 60 Scoop, stealing children, genocide, cultural annihilation, um, sexual abuse, beatings, murders, deaths. And I'm going to say, yeah, the book is beautiful and it's wonderful, and I love it very much. I'm pleased immensely by it. My pleasure is probably quite different than a white settler's. My pleasure is far more based in so many of the people in the photographs and their families and their friends and their communities had never seen these photographs that Paul Seesequasis had located and placed on Instagram and Twitter, Facebook, so that actually matters immensely to me, that entire communities were seeing, photographs from the 1920s into the 1970s of their loved ones, of their friends, their family, and their communities. This idea that somehow Indigenous people aren't just living everyday, ordinary day lives. I don't even know kind of what to do with it. Um, this article, I'm not really, and again, not sure about how to pronounce this name. Prosh, Proshta Dobodies. That's my auntie. A new book reframes photos from Indigenous communities, 19th of October 2019. This is primarily an interview. So it opens, so the first paragraph, and I've quoted it here. Paul Seesequasis' new book, Blanket House Under Midnight Sun, curates archival images with the intention to reframe the Indigenous experiences in 8 communities, 7 in Canada, 1 in the US. Seesequasis, a Willow Cree writer, journalist, and activist who lives in Saskatchewan, wanted to show that amidst the suffering inflicted by the residential school system, life was going on in these communities and love, laughter, art, and culture were continuing to flourish. I'm going to say this because this is actually bothering me. Yeah, you can have love, laughter, art, and of course, culture, even as you suffer. People still laugh and love and make babies and create and cook and eat and hug and kiss each other in all sorts of terrible situations. So, yeah, I think what's really important is, you know, amidst the suffering inflicted, but the idea that I'm not sure, like, I don't understand, I guess, like, the surprise almost, like, that life was going on in these communities. How could it not be? Like, what what's the alternative? This is from paragraph 5 and 6. I was taken aback by the interest, and this is Paul Seesequasis speaking. The followings on social media increased to the thousands, and people began to really relate to the photos. Even if they weren't photos from their community, people found them of interest. I think there are two levels to it. One is the issue of visual reclamation, where communities become familiar with photos that have existed in archives or museums or historical societies and kind of reclaim them as a strength or a connection to their ancestors. And the other level is from the outside, people who aren't Indigenous or aren't from those communities. Hopefully, the photos present a different framing of the Indigenous reality throughout those decades. People laughing, people joking that they don't normally see of Indigenous communities. And this again, or this is a quote from Paul Seesequasis. I decided to focus on 8 communities and the regions, and knowing that in those regions there was enough of a thread to the story of those photos that I could either interview the people in the photos or find the resources to be able to construct a narrative that would do justice to the image and the place and the time and who was in that photo. So he's just explaining why he chose 8 communities, and he's indicating it was for a narrative thread. Um, she asks the question about the photo of Kenojuak Ashevak, a famous artist from Cape Dorset. You wrote, "She is light emerging into the day." Why did you want to include this particular photo in your book? And again, I'm indicating here, I didn't put 2 question marks. I would not do that. I'm indicating I would only put 1 question mark, but I can't correct it because it's a quote. So I'm telling you those double question marks are in the original material. And then the answer of Seesquasis, and he had probably said she. So this is something that the writer placed, and we know that because it's in square brackets. I'm just letting you know I didn't place this here. Kenojuak was just an amazing artist. She had her own distinct style. I think all the artists up there, and he means Cape Dorset, at that time, not all of them lived as long as Kenojuak, but so they perhaps didn't receive the level of recognition that she achieved in her lifetime. But she was a remarkable woman with a remarkable gift. She was an excellent printmaker, and she had an eye for art from her culture. She translated it through her hand onto her own expression that is so unique, so immortal, and that's why it's so respected today. So if you don't know, Kenojuak Ashevak is an internationally famous artist from Cape Dorset, a printmaker. And this is the image that Paul Seesequasis was discussing um, of Kenojuak Ashevak emerging like light out of her tent. So In this photo, she's coming out of the canvas tent, I believe, after doing work within the tent, because there's other photos that Rosemary Eaton took of her actually drawing. So I think those were all taken on the same day. I think as a metaphor, she's emerging from her place of creativity into light, and she's also emerging at that stage onto the world stage. So I think the photo in that way is very prophetic. So this is, of course, a quote from the interview. And this is a photograph of Kenojuak Ashevak in her studio in Cape Dorset, obviously as an older woman. This is Kenojuak Ashevak. She was born in 1927. She passed away in 2013. And this biography is just taken from the Canadian Encyclopedia, and it just talks about her 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 fame, her beginnings, things like that. You can, of course, pause it and read it. And here, this one is talking very involved about her actual artwork. She gained almost immediate attention for her first print, Rabbit Eating Seaweed, in 1958. And it was included in the Cape Dorset print collection and catalog. Her early drawings had simple, bold forms, often featuring birds and creatures metamorphosing into one another. Her iconic The Enchanted Owl from 1960 was used on a postage stamp in the 1970s. And this is this. Make sure I have oh, I need the right thing. This is what we're looking at right here. And this, of course, is Kenojuak Ashevak as a young woman. Her later work became more complicated and highly stylized, eschewing the directness and clarity of her earlier efforts. You'll see them right here. In the ink and color pencil drawing Dog, Caribou Spirit with Birds from 1988 to 1989, there is a female caribou with a human head and bird feet, a bird streaming out of its sides, and in the elaborate dog mother shaman transformation, there is a dog barking and what appears to be a half man, half spiky dragon bursting out of it. Her last year's return to her earlier simplicity, but this time with vibrant color. This is the work I most like of hers. Fine Feathers is just the body of an owl with orange tipped feathers fanning out behind and above, and below has an aquamarine bird flying above what looks like a blue and green sea creature swimming in the opposite direction. So these are, this is one of my favorite pieces of hers. This is not, what we're looking at does not do it justice. The actual background to this is not white, but is blue and green and just contains incredible, I believe it was pencil crayon work, just absolutely stunning. It's in her later work and really just, it's just my favorite piece of hers. These are two are also later works of hers. This is another of my favorite pieces of her work that I love. Rosemary Eaton was born in 1919 and died in 2004. Much of her photographs, especially I think almost all of Cape Dorset, is the work of Rosemary Eaton. And this is her biography. And of course, you can pause this and read it. This is a self-portrait of Rosemary Eaton. This is a photo that she took in 1960 of Kenojuak Ashevak. I really love this photo of Ashevak drawing. This is one of my other very favorite photos from Rosemary Eaton, and it is from 1960, Cape Dorset as well. Isn't that baby cute? The final article is the Indigenous Archival Photo Project, published the 3rd of May 2018. And this article indicates that Paul Seesequasis, quote, began sharing archival images of Indigenous people on his social media feeds in 2015. Portia Prieger goes on to write that, quote, news coverage at the time was dominated by dark stories of past wrongs like abuse at residential schools and the saga of missing or murdered women. Seesequasis, a Plains Cree journalist and cultural activist based in Saskatoon, wanted to create a more empowering storyline about the resistance and resilience of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities. Pregertz, and if I'm butchering that, I'm so sorry. Her article goes on. He began searching through archival collections kept by museums and community groups, and eventually private collections, where he discovered myriad images of people living their lives, working, laughing with friends, and otherwise going about their daily routines. So this is one of the articles that I actually feel gives us the most information. It actually tells us how this project worked and how it began. That he was searching, that Paul Seesequasis searched through archival collections that were kept by museums, community groups, and even private collections, where he discovered all of these images of people living their lives, as this writer says. Often there were no names or notes to explain who these people were or what they were doing. He soon learned that many of the photos, which dated back from the 1920s through to the 1970s, again, she's giving us more information, had never been seen by people in the communities they documented. So she's actually giving us a lot more information than we have had previously. We're seeing from this this writer uh, just facts. This is where how this worked, how this happened. She goes on to write, Seesequasis praises the quality of Eaton's images and her ability to capture people in a relaxed state. And this is a quote from Paul Seesequasis. She was an outside eye, but one, it seems, with not only a keen perception for a good photograph, but also an ability to be unobtrusive. He writes in his curatorial statement. Despite the many hardships brought by colonialism, he says her photographs reflect functioning, hardworking people and communities, mirroring the integrity of previous Indigenous generations. These are not victims. So I'm going to end here. Just Paul Seesequasis quote that these are not victims. So I'm going to offer you some information. According to data from the 2004 General Social Survey on Victimization, 40% of, and I'm quoting, Aboriginal Canadians reported having been a victim of crime in the year leading up to the survey, compared to 28% of non-Aboriginal Canadians. With respect to violent crime, Aboriginal people were 3 times more likely to have been victimized compared to non-Aboriginal people. 319 incidents versus 101 incidents per 1,000 population. These statistics confirm that Aboriginal people are disproportionately represented as victims of crime in Canada. A review of research on criminal victimization in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from 1990 to 2001, and this is a quote, residential schools were not the solitary cause of social breakdown amongst Aboriginal people. Rather, they were the closing punctuation mark in a loud, long declaration saying that nothing Aboriginal could possibly be of value to anyone. That message had been delivered in almost every way imaginable, and it touched every aspect of traditional social organization. Nothing was exempt, whether it was spiritual beliefs and practices, child raising techniques, pharmacology, psychology, dispute resolution, decision making, clan organization, or community governments. And what happens when you are told from every direction and in every way that you and all your people have no value to anyone, no purpose to your lives, no positive impact on the world around you? No one can stand believing those things of themselves. At some point, people brought to this position stand up and demand to be noticed, to be recognized as being alive, as having influence and power. And the easiest way to assert power, to prove that you exist, is to demonstrate power over people who are weaker still, primarily by making them do things they don't want to do. The more those things shame and diminish the weaker person, the more the abuser feels within the twisted logic of victimization that they have been empowered and restored themselves. So, and this is me now talking, the work that Paul Seesequasis has done is admirable, timely, and pertinent. I really like his book immensely. As I've mentioned, especially like that it has returned photographs back to their communities, families, friends, and individuals. However, in saying that these images are of people that are not victims and lumping all of them together across 8 communities is problematic and troubling. Photos of Kenojuak Ashevak smoking and carrying her baby on her back does not erase centuries of racism or stereotypes, regardless of how romantic. And I'm starting out pretty mild here. The Inuit disc numbers that were used by the Canadian government for the Inuit in place of their surnames. These numbers were on small discs like dog tags that the Inuit wore. The daily lives as photographed does not offer an erasure of the victims along the Highway of Tears or in Vancouver's Lower East Side or of the residential school system. These things can all coexist. You can suffer and still laugh. You can leave residential school and still go home and still do laundry and still end up murdered along the Highway of Tears or who knows what. So and I don't mean to leave this on a dark note. I just want a full picture. I don't want these images to undo work. I want them to buttress work and to support it and to be a foundation and a fuller, rounder picture. Okay, thank you very much.